And there's me and him in my bedroom with duvets hanging over us. You're listening to P-Town, Preston's podcast. Hello and welcome to P-Town Podcast. This is Shane. This is going to be a bit different from the usual episodes that I do, in that I don't actually have a guest with me at the moment, but it's about 2 years since I started P-Town Podcast. But I thought in this episode I'd just kind of do an update on the podcast and reflect on what it's been like running a podcast around Preston for 2 years. So I think our first ever episode, properly official episode, was on something of June, 1st of June, something like that. But the idea to do the podcast came about when I was at the Continental on April 21st, my birthday. They had a sort of hip-hop and, a hip-hop day. So it's quite a long drinking session. But the next morning, I remembered one idea that I'd come up with, which was to have a podcast just about Preston. Now, at the time, and for the past 10 years, I've been a project manager for a supply chain company. And I was based in Manchester, and coming back to Preston and walking around Avon Park, especially looking at all the places where I used to mess about as a kid, and then come back and walk around Avon Park every time I come back to visit Preston. But I really sort of appreciated the city with sort of fresh eyes, and I was already doing photography and videography and stuff like that, and I had that as sort of a sort of side hustle, I think you could probably call it. And I thought I may as well try my hand at audio as well. So the idea was that, and I've only just kind of had this conversation today with a guest, a really good guest who you're going to enjoy, that's going to come on the podcast. And when we were talking about the podcast, he got it straight away, and he was saying there's so many people out there who shit on Preston and complain about Preston, but you very rarely hear the voices of those who sing its praises. And that's kind of bang on for exactly what I wanted to do with the podcast, and what I want to do with the podcast is that, first and foremost, I want to showcase people who are doing good stuff in the city, to give voice to that, to celebrate that sort of the work being done by people, whether it's Paul and Serene opening Lonely People, whether it's my last conversation with Rose, doing work with Plough and Rise, to give us, beautiful places in and about the city, or with Womankind North, or the rap duo, FMA plus 12 gauge, everyone who, when you listen to them and they're talking about coming from Preston and the commitment to the city and their love of the city and how proud they are to be from Preston, I felt that if people could hear that, that would be infectious, and that would make them think about what they're doing in the city and the opportunities that people are finding, creating or exploring. And the second part to that is, I suppose, why a podcast? And I think what's really good at podcasts is because you're just listening to someone's voice, or listening to two people's voices, or three, or whatever, a conversation. It's a very intimate and sort of like in the world where we're all the time sort of bombarded by videos and YouTube and pictures and posts and emojis and stuff like that. It's very saturated from a visual perspective, but it just seems such a quiet and subdued and intimate medium when you're listening to someone on a podcast. And so I thought, if I really want to have these people on who are passionate about the city, what better way to do it than through an intimate conversation? And then you, the listener, can listen to that, not only hear exactly what they've done in terms of what you always see in blogs or things like that, or articles, but to actually hear the tone of their voice when they talk about the things that they've done in Preston and why they do it in Preston, and and even just as an individual, what drives them as a person, because it resonates, and we hear these people who had dreams to do stuff, or had a passion and followed it, or did stuff about the city, and it resonates to us, not just as Prestonians, but as other people. And And so that was kind of the idea behind the podcast. So to put those positive voices out there and to try to change the perception of this. We're just an old town. We're just a town. We're just a small city. And to really say, well, look, these people are really doing stuff and they're from Preston. They're doing it in Preston, and listen how passionate they are about it. And so, as I say, it's been 2 years now since that initial idea. And we've had so many fantastic guests on the podcast already. I remember when it was just me and Carl, who first started off, Carl Barnes, who first started off the podcast, and there's me and him in my bedroom with duvets hanging over us. Try to from the outset to make sure that the quality's tip top. And I remember the first interview we did with Keith Johnson, the local historian, and just sweating coming up to it, thinking, I hope I get the recording right and the questions and stuff like that. And now 2 years on, like my last podcast and the best podcast that we've done, no offense to any other guests, I just think the conversation and the flow and the everything was right in this one. It's such an enjoyable thing to do now, and there is no sort of sweating, and it's just really good to. I mean, because if you call someone and you say, I've heard you doing this in the city, would you like to have a conversation about it? It could come off a little bit strange out of the blue, but to designate that time with someone to sit down 45 minutes and say, look, for these next 45 minutes, we're going to talk about your passions about the city and stuff like that. It's become a really enjoyable thing to do now. It's a pleasure to spend, even as an introvert, a pleasure to spend 45 minutes talking to someone who has a passion. And that last podcast, I say, that's probably the best one we've ever done, and this kind of in a way is why I'm doing this podcast. It feels kind of like a turning point. We've got a load of new guests lined up, and really we're sort of. When we're getting a lot of more people on the podcast, we've got people lined up. People have heard the work that we've done, and it's really starting to build some momentum now. So while it kind of feels like we're kind of turning a corner or progressing in some way, I wanted to dip in and say, this is a sort of turning point for the podcast, and then that can be the sort of I don't know, the announcement, I suppose, that we're stepping up our game. And podcasting itself, it's not just the actual podcast. I mean, I've explained the reasons why I think podcasts are powerful. The way they're so intimate, and you can listen to a podcast in the bath or walking the dog or driving a car in places where video and the visual can't reach people. But in actual podcasting, so in just being around Preston and getting people on the podcast and meeting new people, and with those new people saying, look, I'm so interested in what you've got to say. I'm so interested in what you've done that I'm going to record it and, edit it and put it out there and put that time and effort into so everyone in Preston can hear about it. I think it's a really good way to sort of form connections and bonds with people because it's really authentic, and you're showing that commitment of, it's not just that I want to have a 20-minute conversation, but I actually want to take that step further and produce this conversation, because I think it's worth other people hearing. And you get to know people in the city, and it kind of snowballs, and you meet new people, and they tell you about people they know, and that really is the sort of second level goal of the podcast. It's to have at least play a part in connecting people in creating a network in Preston. We've all got these sort of little cliques that we kind of inhabit on social media and stuff like that. But I just think if we all connected a lot more, then we all kind of be stronger, and we'd all see that the work that other people are doing and be aware of it. And I think that'd be inspiring and kind of have some sort of perhaps it would sort of create some sort of accountability. We feel like we're working for something greater than just exactly what we've sort of got our head down doing, but we feel like we're part of a community in Preston where, we're trying to push things forward. And speaking of networks, we did some work with an arts group called Derelict in partnership with UCLan. So we produced the Preston Calling podcast. That was really good. We spoke to Prestonians from all over the world to tell us about their Prestons. And that was a really good sort of turning point as well was when I started to produce podcasts for other people as well. That was sort of the baptism of fire, but that was really well received. We got articles all over the world, radio and interviews, etc. So it was really good to then not only just try to do what we can do on the inside of the podcast in terms of guests and connecting people, but then sort of turn those skills facing outwards and help others do the same. So which brings me on to, you've probably, if you follow us on Instagram, seen that we changed our name from P-Town Podcast to P-Town Studios. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I have been a photographer and videographer for quite a while. And I was already doing a lot of work around the city and obviously doing work for P-Town as well. And so I thought it was a good idea to sort of pull in together all the stuff we were doing with the podcasts and with sort of creating online content, videos, photo, into one space, so that this same motivation to support the city or to celebrate the city or to be part of that movement, that we could do that with both the podcast and with our photography that we've been doing for local restaurants and bars, and for the videography that we've been doing for some small businesses as well. And that would be sort of the perfect position for me if I could really be part of, if we could do something that mattered in the city, and I know the podcast matters and the ideas I have for it and the guests that we're going to have, it's going to continue to matter. But just having just one central sort of focus on, okay, this is P-Town Studios. What can we get involved in? Who can we reach out to? Who can we connect with? What can we do sort of our sort of side projects and just exploring ideas, and who can we work with in the city as well. And I think that brings me up to date. So as I mentioned, we've got quite a lot of guests lined up, some really interesting conversations to have. We're going to try and change things up, freshen things up around here. It feels like it's a new start to the old normal, the new normal, or a normal. And it feels like a good time for kicking things off. So if you've been listening from the start of the podcast, thank you. If you're new to the podcast, I hope you're enjoying it so far, and thanks for listening as well. And I will see you, or you'll hear me on the next one. Peace. P-Town Podcast is produced by P-Town Studios, a creative agency smack bang in the middle of the concrete jungle. If you're thinking of upping your content game, be that photos, videos or branding, or if you'd like a podcast of your own, you can find out more on how we can help at ptown.co.uk. Lastly, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, as we'd love to see a little podcast from Preston pop up on the global podcast charts. Thank you for listening.
Without have no soul.